Good morning, everyone. Thank you once again so much for coming. As Michael introduced us all, I'm Colleen, for those of you who do not know. So I am one of the curators of Hollar's Encyclopedic Eye. And putting on a show, there is a team that puts on every exhibition that we do. And sometimes the faces in this team change from people who work specifically with works on paper, to objects, to paintings, to sculpture. But the whole idea for this talk today was really to give everyone just a more clear understanding of the fact that it is a team. It takes a village to put on an exhibition here at VMFA. And this particular show was years in the making. It started out when Frank Razor, who is the donor of this amazing collection of Wenceslas Hollar prints, started collecting it decades ago in Manhattan. And he bought one print, realized that Hollar hadn't really been given his due in history, and he was prolific. And so that started, I call it the Cal Ripken Jr. streak, where ultimately, Frank has collected 2,500 Wenceslas Hollar prints. So what you see upstairs is only a tenth of Frank Razor's entire collection, which is astounding if you think of it that way. And so really for us, the ball gets rolling with going through all of those 2,500 prints, ultimately selecting the 10% that we can fit in Evans Court, the space that this exhibition is located. And then it becomes, a list of questions. How do we frame it? How do we mat it? How do we present it to the audiences? How do we introduce this prolific artist to Richmond? And before we actually get to what you see upstairs, which is what I can help clarify, I would like to invite first Heather Emerson and then Heather Godlewski up to the stage so that they can tell you what they did to make the presentation of the works absolutely astounding. So please help me in welcoming Heather to the stage.
I had the privilege of working on the conservation treatments for the works on paper in the Wenceslas Hollar exhibition. Today I will tell you about how the exhibition was prepared for display and about the collaborative efforts it took to make sure that the project was completed on time. First, I want to clarify what conservation is for anyone who doesn't already know. Perhaps you've heard of restoration. It's common to equate restoration and conservation. But actually, while restorers are normally attempting to bring an art object back to what they think it once looked like, conservators are more focused on maintaining and improving the physical and chemical stability of an object. Conservators undergo years of training. They have backgrounds in studio arts, art history, and chemistry. Conservators must demonstrate good hand skills, have an understanding of an object's art historical significance, and as well as a comprehension of the chemical mechanisms of how that object degrades over time and how a treatment technique might affect it. Conservation professionals are bound by the Code of Ethics established by the American Institute for Conservation, or AIC. Part of the responsibility for caring for our cultural heritage is making sure that every object that undergoes treatment is fully documented with both written reports and with before and after treatment photography. Preparing the works on paper for the Hollar exhibition was a massive undertaking. The checklist included 261 etchings, 1 drawing, and 14 books. The first step was to examine everything on the checklist and make sure everything was structurally sound for display. Did the object display any tears or weaknesses to the support? Were there any attachments that could impede matting and framing? Did the print display any planar distortions or discoloration? Another consideration was consistency. I knew when I started the project that many of the prints would be matted together in one mat. So if 1 out of the 6 was severely discolored, it could be distracting to the viewer, and we wanted to avoid that. Upon completion of the survey process, I realized that 246 of the prints and all of the books required some treatment in preparation for display. So that's 95% of the checklist. We were working on a tight deadline for this project. All of the treatments needed to be completed within the year to give enough time for matting and framing before the installation. And as with every exhibition at the VMFA, many people from several departments were involved in making sure that the project was completed on time. I relied on colleagues in other departments such as curatorial, registration, and imaging resources to make sure that everything ran smoothly. During the condition assessment process, I organized the treatments into batches depending on treatment needs. Some prints required very minor treatments, like the removal of attachments, like these gummed paper hinges. Tape hinges like these would have been attached to the print during previous matting and framing campaigns. And in many cases, the adhesive on the tape degrades and discolors, eventually penetrating into the paper. If we were to leave the tape on the print, it could weaken and discolor the paper support over time. Other prints required more treatment, such as large tears, like this tear in the belly and the members. Tears like these needed to be matted and framed in order to be structurally safe to mat. Tears like these needed to be repaired in order to be structurally safe to mat and frame. Tears in the paper support are mended from the back with mulberry paper and wheat starch paste and left to dry under weight. And the reason we use wheat starch paste is because it's reversible and does not yellow with age. Mulberry paper is used for men's because it's thin but long fibered, and so it's very strong relative to its weight. Many prints were also discolored, like these examples. This is Charles II, head of a cat, and jug decorated with arabesques. Discoloration often occurs when paper-based objects are housed in poor quality mats or folders. Acids migrate into the cellulose chains that comprise paper and break them down through degradation mechanisms like acid hydrolysis. If you look at the edges of jug decorated with arabesques, that discoloration was actually caused by tape on the back of the print. Prints like these were grouped into the moderate treatment category because they would require a bath in order to reduce the discoloration. And finally, there were a handful of prints that required extensive and invasive treatment, such as a backing removal. In the 19th century, it was common practice for collectors to glue their fine art prints into album pages, such as the fate of this impression of Hollar's still life with a group of muffs, a pair of gloves, and 2 kerchiefs. As I previously mentioned, poor quality acidic housing like this backing could cause damage to the print that's adhered to it. Removing a backing from an object is a long, tedious process. Basically, it involves sitting for hours with the object and slowly and carefully scraping backing paper fibers from the verso of the object with a scalpel, sometimes using minimal moisture to soften any adhesive that may be present. It's a scary treatment. Untrained hands not using the most delicate precision can put a hole right through the print. So it's not a treatment to be taken lightly, but it is necessary to preserve the object and prevent more discoloration and damage in the future. Testing of the media and support prior to treatment is extremely important. During the condition assessment, I performed solubility tests to make sure that the prints were not sensitive to water. Printing ink, like what Hollar used to print his images, is oil-based and usually, therefore, not very sensitive to water. But many of the prints in this collection displayed collector's marks like these, which sometimes were sensitive to water, which would limit the treatment options we had available. It used to be very common practice in the 19th and early 20th century for collectors to stamp their works of art on paper in their personal collection. And these marks can provide valuable insight into an artwork's provenance. They are fascinating to study. And several years ago, when I worked in the registration department, I helped Mr. Razor catalog his collection. And during that time, I learned a lot about collector's marks, such as how to study them and their importance. So when I looked at these marks again more recently from a conservation point of view, I recognized many of the important marks immediately. However, when I tested them, unfortunately, some of them did turn out to be very sensitive to water. So for instance, a print like this, this is a print of Charles I on horseback, and it did require extensive treatment. I was really limited on what I could accomplish. You can see this print is mounted overall to another sheet of paper, and there's tape along the edges. And this has already started to discolor the print. However, you can see at the bottom left corner, there's also this collector's mark, and it would be destroyed were I to try to remove the backing. Also, this mark happens to be very water sensitive, and so there's potential for it to bleed through to the front of the print and cause disfiguring stains if I were to try to introduce moisture. So although this print could have benefited from treatment, I was not able to do much with it. In this case, the collector's mark has already bled through to the front of the print, right in the middle of the image. This is infant Hercules asleep, and on the verso you can see the collector's mark of Leonard Baskin. Leonard Baskin was a 20th century artist and collector, and his mark often included this pomegranate stamp as well as a written element. But unfortunately, in this case, Mr. Baskin's mark came right through to the front of the image, right over the figure's face and shoulder. So for prints that did not have sensitive marks, I was able to proceed with the treatment that they needed. This is Radicofani, and you can see from this before treatment image that this print is very discolored. Again, acidic housing at some point in the lifetime of this print likely caused this discoloration. By washing the print, I could rid it of discoloration while introducing some alkalinity into the support, which would increase the strength of the paper by neutralizing the acids that were introduced by poor quality housing. Many people are not aware that you can actually wash paper. It's a treatment technique that paper conservators use after an object has been thoroughly tested, displays no sensitivity to water, and would benefit from washing. And there are many ways of washing works of art on paper, but the method that I use the most when washing the works on paper in the Hollar collection is called blotter washing. And traditionally, blotter paper is used, which is a highly absorbent cotton rag paper. But we have adopted the use of a reusable material called Tech Wipe, which is a fabric made from polyester and cellulose. Layers of Tech Wipe are first soaked with calcium-enriched deionized water, and then the humidified print, which is sandwiched between layers of polyweb for support, is lightly brushed down into contact on the wet Tech Wipe. So during this process, the discoloration is wicked out of the support and onto the Tech Wipe through capillary action. And you can kind of see the yellow areas here of the degradation products on the Tech Wipe. After the bath, the print is humidified and flattened, and here are the before and after treatment images. The support is much brighter, and the details of Hollar's etching are easier to see. Additionally, the paper support is now physically and chemically stronger and healthier as a result of the bath. And the last treatment I'd like to mention is the humidification and flattening of Prog. As you can see in this before treatment raking light image, the print displayed pronounced distortions. Prog was printed on 3 sheets that were joined on the back with paper strips. These joins created some undulations, but there are also these sharp vertical creases throughout the support because the print had originally been folded into a bound volume. Besides being visually distracting, the planar distortions created a safety issue for the object as well. For display, the print would be secured into a mat with mulberry paper hinges and framed, and the mat package requires the object to be pressed between the window mat and a backing with some force. So any undulations present could become creases. For this reason, the primary treatment goal was to try to reduce the distortions and stabilize the paper in preparation for display. The attachments on the back of the print that joined the 3 sheets together created some problems for flattening. Typically, humidifying and flattening a work of art on paper generally works best when the object is free from any attachments and not constricted in any way. But we didn't know if the 3 sheets would line up again properly if we removed those attachments. So we opted to leave them in place. There were numerous flattening techniques, but for this object, we used a flattening technique called friction flattening to smooth out the creases and wrinkles. Friction flattening relies on the unique properties of various types of paper. First, the print is humidified with slow and controlled exposure to water vapor to help relax the paper fibers. Next, the 2 sheets of mulberry paper are humidified with a fine mist of water. The humidified print is sandwiched between humidified mulberry paper and dry blotter paper, and then the sandwich is put under glass and weight and left to dry. Mulberry paper is used for this technique because it's more dimensionally stable and expands less when humidified. And as the print dries, it is pulled flat against the mulberry paper as it desorbs water and contracts. The movement of the print's support against the mulberry paper creates friction, which releases the creases and planar distortions. After flattening, I mended the edge tears and reinforced the weakened creases with strips of mulberry paper and wheat starch paste. And here is the finished product. The flattening technique improved the planar distortions, and the print is now stable and ready to mat and frame. So now I will turn it over to my colleague, Heather Godlewski, who will tell you about the matting and framing of all of the Hollar prints.
Hi. I am the other Heather. So my primary responsibilities in the Hollar exhibition were the safe hinging, matting, and framing of the prints in the show, or what is often referred to as housing in conservation lingo. Using best practices with regards to housing materials and techniques are vital to the longevity of any artwork, and preservation through better housing is a big part of the mission of paper conservation, since many damages to paper-based objects come down to how they were stored or exhibited and what materials were used in the process. On this image, which Heather E. already shared with you, you've seen that these damages could include discoloration from poor quality backing or adhesives used in hinging or mounting, seen in the corner there. Poor housing might also cause mat burn, which in our world is not a wrestling injury, but a discoloration caused by poor quality window mat. This slide is also a great example of the discoloration that occurs with pressure-sensitive tape. Scotch tape is an example of a pressure-sensitive tape. And if you remember nothing else I say today, please remember not to use Scotch tape to mount or to fix your torn artwork, because that's what happens eventually. And don't worry, this is not part of the VMFA or the Frank Razor collection, but an image I borrowed from the internet. Fading from light exposure is another pitfall of poor housing or poor exhibition choices. Seen here is an extreme example of a faded family photo, but prints too, especially those with color inks, are susceptible to fading from light damage. This damage is absolutely irreversible. Surface abrasion is another pitfall. Poor housing can cause abrasions, which can happen when a glazing comes into contact with the surface of the art. In this example, on a pastel by Michael Williams, which is again not part of the VMFA collection, the distortions in the paper were in contact with the original glass, and the resulting friction abraded the pastel from the paper. So a better strategy is preventive conservation, which means we protect the work from the beginning, using the best quality materials possible, applied in the most thoughtful way possible. In case some of you aren't familiar with the matting and framing process, I want to share this diagram from the American Institute of Conservation website. This diagram shows the layers involved, starting in the center with the artwork. The art will have some sort of hinging system, which I'll come back to in a bit. The hinges secure the art. Always me. The hinges secure the art to the back mat support. A window mat goes in front. This goes in front of the artwork. And the window has two purposes. One is obviously to give the artwork a finished quality. But the more important task, I would say, is that it prevents the glazing from touching the surface of the artwork, thus avoiding abrasions. Behind the back mat, we typically use a backing board, which adds rigidity to the package and an added layer of protection from damages from behind, such as a puncture. The glazing, the mat package, and a backing board are then placed into a frame. So in all of these materials, quality matters to the safety of the artwork. And the VMFA, therefore, uses 100% lignin-free ragboard mat board, meaning that the harmful acid-producing components have been removed from the paper during processing. We use a 99% ultraviolet filtering plexiglass, and as an dermatologist will tell us, UV is the most harmful wavelength of light. The plexi is also anti-static, meaning it doesn't attract loose or powdery media, such as a pastel, to its surface. And it's anti-reflective, meaning the viewer is able to see the artwork without the visual distractions that reflections might cause. Finally, the hinges used to hold the Hollar prints in place were made with long-fibered mulberry paper and attached with wheat starch paste, meaning they are stable, strong, and will be easily removable in the future, which is a huge tenet of conservation. And I'm going to sound like a commercial for a second, which isn't my intention, but I do want to recognize the folks at Rick's Custom Framing who cut all the mats in the show. The complicated multiple window mats in the Hollar show would have added another really dense layer of work for us, so they were immensely helpful in taking over that task. And the frames in the show are specially built and stained by several local makers to meet our needs and aesthetics, so they are all an important part of the VMFA team. So now back to hinging. Two types of hinging techniques were employed in the Hollar exhibition. The first is seen in this diagram from the Library of Congress website. These are T-hinges. T-hinges are used when an artwork will be overmatted, meaning that all the edges of the artwork will sit behind a window mat. Overmatting is always preferable for the safety of the artwork, since the edges of any sheet of paper are vulnerable to damages. Edges are typically where tears begin and where distortions from changes in temperature and humidity will begin to be most prevalent. Keeping the edges of the artwork safely tucked behind a window mat lessens the likelihood of tears and distortions forming in the paper to begin with. Over their long lives, many of the prints in the Hollar exhibition have been very closely trimmed to the edges of the plate marks, leaving little or no room for overmatting without obstructing the image. In a few cases, such as on Hollar's map of Jamaica, seen here, a mulberry paper margin was added to the edge with wheat starch paste. This gave us enough of a margin to safely overmat the object without obstructing too much information near the edges. Because so many of the prints in the exhibition are trimmed so close to the plate mark, the majority of the prints in the show were float mounted, meaning that the edges of the paper are all exposed. This allows us to see the full image with its plate mark, and in the case of Hollar's map of Africa here, floating the print allows us to see all of those gorgeous iron gall ink notations written in the margins. Float mounting can be accomplished in a couple of ways. My preferred method is to use mulberry paper hinges passed through slits, cut through the backing board of a mat. And so you understand what I just said. I want to share with you a demo of the process in a video made by VMFA media specialist Sharad Patel. So to start with, the object has the hinges already attached to the back, and I've figured out where I wanted it in the window and weighted it down, and now I am marking either side of the hinges so I know where slits need to be cut. There's going to be a lot of me not talking for this. You're welcome. And now I can get the object out of the way while I bring out the sharp tools. Here I'm cutting the slits in the back mat. This requires several passes with a very sharp blade. It's very important that these slits be correctly positioned. If they're too high, you'll be able to see them above the artwork, which is distracting. If they're too low or wonky, your art will be crooked or distorted, hang incorrectly. I also really should have had a manicure for this video. You can see this all takes some time, and this is the edited version. So here I'm erasing the marks I made because if I didn't, those two would be visible above the artwork. So now I'm beginning to pass the hinges through the back mat. I use a tool that I make from Mylar. Mylar is a polyester film that we use for various things in conservation. Here I've cut a small piece and folded it into a V, and by wrapping it around the hinge, I can use it to thread the hinge through the slit without damaging it. And here's the other side from underneath. You'll notice I'm working face up through all of this, and that's one of the benefits of this method. It's good to work face up, especially with vulnerable media. You don't want to have to put it on its face. Another benefit of this method I'll just mention here is that pass-through hinges lessen the possibility that the artwork will sag over time, which I've seen with other hinging methods. Now I can trim off the excess. I needed some slack to pull that hinge through, but we don't need all of that extra material now. And now I'm going to paste the hinge. It's wheat starch paste. And then I'm burnishing the hinge down. It's almost over. So once those are dry, now you'll see me starting to cut accordion hinges. They're also called zigzag hinges. These are secondary hinges that I apply to the lower edge of the artwork. If those weren't there and you tilted the frame forward and you only have hinges at the top, the artwork would float forward and hit the plexi or the glazing, which could damage the artwork. These are very tiny, and they require a lot of patience and focus to fold them correctly. Heather E. is an ace at it. So now I'm situating those hinges on a jig that I make, again, out of Mylar. This also requires a lot of patience and focus. And as I recall, this one wasn't behaving very well when we made this demo. The jig I'm using is an L-shaped jig. This allows me, again, since I'm working with everything face up, it helps me to sort of feel where I'm placing the hinge. So just slipping it underneath, making sure it's attached. And then I weight it down. Once that hinge is dry, that jig will slip right out from underneath. So that labor-intensive process was repeated many, many, many times for the Hollar exhibition. and often on the same mat with multiple openings, as seen here in the 7 of the 14 insect prints seen in the show. Once matting was completed, each mat was placed into a frame with UV filtering glazing. Records were updated, and my part in the process was more or less complete, though regular monitoring of the work continues throughout the exhibition. The effort required to put forward an engaging exhibition doesn't end with conservation or housing. After leaving our department, the art is destined to be installed by the careful hands of the VMFA's skilled art handlers and registrars. And curators, in this case Colleen, are involved with decision-making throughout the installation. So I'm going to turn it back over to her now. Thank you.
I'm back. So, if you took a tour of Hollar with me in the past 12 weeks that the show's been open, most of these things that I'm going to cover in the next few minutes are things that I would have told you on a tour in the actual space. But since we don't have the actual space here, we're just going to use photos. So, in sort of thinking about it, the 4 biggest areas that the decisions that I make, for better or worse, affect a visitor's viewing experience come down to layout, so where we hang it, the design of the space, so how does the space look and present itself to viewers, the paint color, which is a sort of supplementing factor of design, and then the lighting choices. And as my husband will tell you, there is a reason behind everything that I do, for better or for worse. And so I'm going to explain that reasoning to you. So layout. Knowing that we had 250 prints in about 150 frames that we had to fit into Evans Court, and we have just begun using as a museum movable walls, which are these 12-foot by 12-foot by 18-inch thick, literally movable walls. We had 8 of them that I could position wherever I thought they would be best suited in this space. And we mercifully have a model that is to scale with the little walls. You can see them to scale here. And so for the first few weeks on this project, I tinkered with this thing. And this is like the dollhouse I never had as a child. And it's wonderful because you really get a sense for how the space is going to behave and how people are going to move through the space. So just to orient us here, if you've been through Hollar, you enter up here, and then you come into this little space here. That didn't change really from the first part of me designing the layout of the entire exhibition. What changed was what we did with the rest of Evans Court. And so this was a very early design for the layout on the left, and then you can see a couple of weeks later on the right, and I documented this all because if I, by accident, bumped into it and everything fell over, would I be able to set it up the same way and remember it? Probably not. So as you can see a couple weeks later, this once again still really hasn't changed, but now my conception for how someone is going to walk through the space is becoming more linear. And so as I created the narrative that you experience, the space supplements that overall narrative. And so once I finally made my decision and said, yes, final answer, that is when exhibition design starts actually to scale, laying in the frames on top of the floor plan. And so this was the working floor plan that when we installed Hollar, this is what we were going off of. This was our map. And it looks very intense, it looks very dense, but it is a merciful, merciful tool to have when you are in that space because all of the prints are numbered and are shown according to which frame they correspond to. And so this is the front entryway where you are introduced to Hollar and the etching process. This is space number 1, which since the exhibition is set up chronologically through Hollar's life, this is the work that dates to his earliest part of his career, when he is still living on the continent. He's born in Prog in the Kingdom of Bohemia and pretty much trains all throughout the German states before meeting the Earl of Arundel and moving to England. And that's when his career really gets a boost. And so This is the first part of his life when he's on the continent. This area here was dedicated and reserved to what he produced while he was living in England and was receiving the Earl of Arundel's patronage. But if you've been to the exhibition, you know that something called the English Civil War broke out. And in order to avoid all of that tumult, Hollar elected to go to the continent, where it was slightly more peaceful. They were in the ending years of the 30 Years' War there, but Hollar really considered it more the lesser of two evils. And so this third large space, this constitutes a selection of his body of work that he produced when he was on the continent, living in Antwerp. And then for reasons unbeknownst to us, he elected, after living in Antwerp for 8 years, to go back to England. And so his output from those years make up the selection of works in this final room. So to me, it seemed like the walls facilitated this chronological journey through Hollar's life and Hollar's art. So that's layout. When it came to design, after I had sort of said, okay, this is where we need these works of art and why, now it becomes the fun of how do we present the space to the viewer. And when I came on the project, the works that were being conserved in conservation were the books, the 14 wonderful period books in all of their glory. And if you've seen them in the exhibition, I love an old book. I hope you love an old book. These things are great. They have the marbleized papers in the front. They have different fonts. They have illustrations that were inserted. And so exhibition and design and me really decided that we should carry this theme throughout the entire show. That the design choices that we make in terms of what fonts do we do the didactics in, the wall labels, the text panels, what fonts? Should they be capitalized? Should they be italicized? Should they have serifs or no serifs? What color should the font be? How should we convey the typography? All of these choices really came back to books, both 17th century examples and also modern day examples, because I didn't want it to be literally like you were walking into a book and that idea sort of hitting everyone over the head. So we opted for a more toned down version of that. But you can see here in the opening sort of introduction to the exhibition, you have larger fonts next to smaller fonts. And even though I know that this is not teeny tiny, there is a difference. And then in terms of doing a sort of new age, book sort of example, having this idea of inserting the prints into the text panels. And this served two purposes. It made it seem more like a modern day textbook where you do have paragraphs that wrap around images, but it also allowed me to use more prints, put them on the wall so that they would not have to be double hung somewhere else. Because if we take up all of that space just with text, then I have to find a wall space to hang another print, which is, in this particular exhibition, kind of problematic because there's only so much wall space that we have that we can use. And as you can see, the choices were not random. It's not like The Price is Right where you sort of spin the wheel and you land on a number and that's the font size you're going to pick. These are deliberate choices. And for the opening text especially, it was, a meeting where we had 15 people involved. We printed out 3 different versions. We taped them on the wall, and this was October 24th of last year. Howardina Pindell's show was in Evans Court at this time, and you can literally see, we taped it up at the exact height that people would be reading it. We had the different sizes, and out of that meeting, we decided what font sizes to use throughout the exhibition. The other major design component that came out of using books as our inspiration were the wall stickers. And throughout the exhibition upstairs, there are 4 instances where we took either a part of a print or an entire print, and we blew it up so that it literally fills a wall. So we have one of Hollar's print after Peter Paul Rubens' Lions from Daniel in the Lion's Den. We have this print on the wall here of the clerics walking to the abbey. We have a print of St. Paul's Cathedral in the process of burning down in the last room. And then we have an image of ruins that Hollar wrote, which is sort of where the exit is in the exhibition. So all of these design choices goes back to books and the inspiration from the books that are in the collection. Now, in terms of paint, because what are the walls going to look like when you put these on there? The prints, as the Heathers showed you, are kind of an off-white. A cream color is, as close to their natural state as we can get it. And so I was against, from the get-go, of doing a stark white wall. I didn't want to accentuate the fact that the prints were a shade of beige. And, traditionally the world was not pristine white in the 17th century. It did have color. But what colors do you pick? Benjamin Moore offers you thousands of possibilities to pick from. And once again, it is not random. So in order to pick what we thought would be the best colors for you to see these prints against, we used the only gallery that was available to us into the museum that offered us the exact lighting conditions that these prints would have to receive in Evans Court. And the lighting in Evans Court is rather dim. In museum terms, it's set at 5 candles, which is a unit of measuring light. And it's dimmer for works on paper because, as Heather Godlewski told you, damage by light is irreversible. And so you need it dim so that the prints maintain their integrity over the course of their existence, which will be longer than my lifetime, hopefully, here on Earth. These prints are 350 years old. And so in the South Asian galleries, this wall is all lit to 5 candles, which is exactly what we needed. And the other thing is, this wall is not white. It's colored. And it's a color that works nicely with prints. And it sort of exudes the sort of a complementary aspect of the culture that the prints are sort of emulating. And so literally what we did is we asked our registrars to bring us some of the framed Hollar prints up to this gallery so that we could hold it up against the wall in the right light, and we could slide paint chips behind it. And by the end of this meeting, we had decided on 2 different colors. And once again, everyone has their camera phones out. We are documenting this so that we do not lose those paint chips. But these were the 2 colors that we picked. And the reason why there are 2 and not just 1 is because when I think of Hollar's life, and in knowing that a viewer is going to move through his life chronologically, there are 2 good periods in Hollar's life, and there are 2 not so good, at least what I would consider not so good periods of his life. And so I wanted the areas where Hollar had good memories and fond memories, and he had prosperity as a printmaker, to be lighter. Literally, it's a very simple metaphor. You have light, you have happiness, the outlook is bright. And then for the areas and the periods of his life where things were not as optimistic, I wanted a slightly cooler, darker color to sort of give that sense of unease, just subtly, but to make that effect nonetheless. And so in the opening to the exhibition, you get all of this compressed in this one room. You didn't realize it, but it's all there. You get both colors. You get the darker green, you get the lighter sort of beige that we used. And throughout the galleries, when you walk through it, it's a kind of dramatic switch, which is also helped by the lighting. And so this is the last topic that I just want to sort of briefly share sort of the overall thought process behind why we do what we do in this exhibition. Where the prints are, it's 5-foot candles. It's that dim light to protect them. But in the opening room, where it has works that are corresponding to Hollar's first part of his career, where the outlook isn't that great yet, so we have the darker wall color, What I asked Ryan Schmidt, who is our head lighting designer, to do is to make the room darker. So once again, it's a very simple metaphor. The future isn't bright here. His life is not necessarily always happy. And so the way that we tried to make the gallery seem brighter or darker is whether or not we illuminated the floor. So that when you're in the darker galleries, there is not a lot of light that is bouncing off of the floor. And when you move into the lighter galleries where Hollar is receiving a lot of patronage and he has this prosperity, you have the light on the floor, the light on the walls. It's literally a more inviting, welcoming space. And so here we're just going to take a little sojourn through the exhibition. Moving through, things are bright, life's good. Moving through into the room, into the time when Hollar is in Antwerp, the lighting is on the floor, the walls are white or Carrington beige, and things are still good. But you can literally see the line. You walk into a darker space. And so when Hollar goes back to England for the second time and where he remains for the rest of his life, he said that after the Civil War, people didn't smile. People weren't happy like they used to be because they had just lived through such an atrocious time. And so this really, I think, helped conveys that sense of unease. And so this last image is really looking back out through that last room into the time when Hollar was in Antwerp. And once again, you really see the juxtaposition between the dimness of the last room and sort of the bright, happier nature of his time in Antwerp. And so all of these different things we think, are very important and vital to understanding Hollar. And we hope that we sort of, took away the smoke and the mirrors and made things a little bit more understandable about why we do the things we do and we make the choices that it is that we do. And hopefully I honored the prints in making them look their best in the gallery. And so thank you all so much for your kind attention and for coming today. And Izzy is proud of me. I stayed within time, so we do have time for about a 10-minute Q&A if anyone has any queries that are percolating in their brains. And so I'd like to invite the Heathers up on the stage, and hopefully we can answer any questions you may have.
Does incandescent lighting harm prints as opposed to fluorescent incandescent lighting?
All lighting can hurt works on paper.
We keep them in the closet.
Unfortunately, yes. All lighting, visible, ultraviolet, all lighting can harm works on paper. What we do is try our best to mitigate the damage as much as possible while letting the public enjoy the prints and keep them out of dark storage forever. But every exhibition that we have, we put things up on view generally for about 6 months, and then they go back into storage for about 4 times that length of time. And that helps preserve them for as long as possible.
So are you conserving the other 90% of the etchings?
So our workload is intense. We basically have to work on a exhibition basis. So as things are called for display, when one of the curators asks for something to go on display, that is when the beginning of the treatment starts. I hope one day we get to treat every single thing in our collection, but there's 3 of us in the paper conservation department: Heather Godlewski, myself, and our fearless leader, Samantha Sheasley, who is our only paper conservator. And she only came on board in 2015. So we're working as fast as we can.
When you wash the prints, how in the world do you figure out how to do that without degrading any of the ink? on the etching?
Yes, so as I mentioned, testing of the media is the absolute first thing we do. It is extremely important. If during that testing process, if anything displays even the slightest sensitivities, we do not wash it. As I mentioned, oil-based ink, most of the printing ink is oil-based ink. It's not going to be sensitive to water. So the things that I was really looking for, although I did test that as well, but the things that were really going to be problematic were the collector's marks and any kind of written inscriptions that may have been on the print. But for things that were not Hollars, in this collection, it's every single thing, every color, every single area of the print is thoroughly tested. And that's how we know nothing's going to wash away.
Hey.
Hi, Mary.
How are you? I had a question for Colleen. Of these prints and just of Hollar's prints in general, like how many of them would have actually been in books? Because you had the books there, and then there were a lot on the wall that may have been in books at some point. Like how did he usually work, or what was he usually commissioned to do?
Okay, so Hollar, really during the last 25 years of his life, that is when he, for the most part, concentrates most of his efforts on book illustration. And so many of the illustrations that he did are in a larger volume. So sometimes he did a dozen illustrations for a particular publisher. Sometimes he would do 40 or 50 or 60. It depends on which book and which author, publisher he's working with. Some people, once they realized that they were Hollar prints, actually cut the illustrations out of the books. And so it's like on the wall that has the sticker of St. Paul's Cathedral in the process of burning down, there is a lovely illustration that shows a view down the nave of the church. That originally was in a book. And so many of those prints today that you experience singly were meant to be bound at one point in time. But most of the time, people would buy singular prints, put them in a portfolio, glue them into a larger book. But it's really in the last third of his life that you see him doing book illustrations. Hopefully that answers.
Do we have any idea how many of each print were made? Were there indications of whether it was the first or the 20th pressing?
Okay. Can I field that one?
Please.
Awesome. Okay, so with etching as a process in the 17th century, editions are not numbered. That is something that really comes into its own in the 19th century, where artists are creating these limited editions being sold at very high prices. And so back in the 17th century, the plates were printed until literally the detail and the clarity of the plate was compromised, or they literally broke in the printing press. So ideally, using an average plate in the 17th century, using normal print making mechanisms, you could get about 200 of a good quality from a plate before either those lines had to be re-etched or literally they just stopped printing the plate. Now there's a catalog raisonné, which is the best book in the world for any artist. It's a list of everything that an artist does during their life. And this particular catalog raisonné for Hollar's works, it's in 9 volumes. It's in my office if you ever want to see it. And it lists the institutions that own examples of individual prints. And so that are in public collections. Private collectors don't always make it known that they own particular prints. But for many of his finest works, like the Fur Still Life, okay, that was pasted onto that acidic backing, there's only a couple dozen that exist in the world. So about 10% has come down through history and survives that we know of and that have been documented. So when you see one of these prints up in our exhibition, to think about that it had at one point in time 199 brothers and sisters, and now it's dwindled down to maybe 19 brothers and sisters around the world. It gives you a sense of just how much, over time we've lost.
Please join me in thanking our presenters today.